going to talk about human rights. But as many of you will know, we're also concerned about implications for climate change, biodiversity loss, and a range of other issues. A UK consultation on a trade deal with the Gulf Cooperation Council closed back in January. We are now still waiting for the response to that from the government. The government claims that this deal would promote peace, security, and stability in the Middle East region, although there's very little detail to support that claim. So in this session, we're going to explore the motivations behind the deal and how the UK might seek to align its trade relations with Gulf state with its other foreign policy objectives, particularly those around human rights. And a question we might want to ask is whether the UK should make meeting certain social, environmental, and human rights goals a precondition of trade agreements, not just for the Gulf states, but across the board. We know there's a precedent for that under the generalized system of preferences, particularly under GSP+, where countries can only have access to those preferences if they have ratified and are implementing a range of agreements such as those under the International Labour Organization, ILO. So I'm very pleased that we're joined by a panel of experts to help us explore these issues. I'll introduce them as we go along before they speak. So without further ado, let me introduce Tom Wills. Tom is a project manager for corporate accountability and trade at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, an organisation that works to advance human rights in business and eradicate abuse. He previously worked at Tradecraft Exchange and as a civil servant, and has volunteered in Nepal with Transparency International. In his current role, he analyses the impact of the UK's post-Brexit trade arrangements on efforts to achieve corporate accountability. Tom, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ruth. And it's great to have the opportunity to speak on this panel. As Ruth touched upon, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre is a global NGO that tracks the human rights impacts of companies, and then we use the wealth of evidence built up through over 20 years of work to propose solutions that will protect rights and hold corporations accountable. And the first thing to say is that we see trade as a force for good. It creates opportunities for prosperity, development, international partnership. However, we're also aware that the rules of trade tend to be written to the advantage of companies, and that trade deals, as they're currently structured, tend to serve to exacerbate the power imbalances that already exist in our world between the global south and the global north, and between workers in supply chains and those companies and global brands. I'm just going to make some initial comments to set the scene. I'll explain a bit about what trade deals are and why human rights are relevant to this discussion. And then I'll talk about some tests that we'd want a UK Gulf trade deal to meet if it was going to really deliver for human rights. I won't go into details about the human rights issues in the region because I think my fellow panelists are much better positioned to comment on that side of things. So just to start at the most basic level, free trade agreements are agreements negotiated between countries, and they intend to make it easier and cheaper to trade bilaterally. They do that by bringing tariffs down, and they also contain other elements designed to encourage trade, like investment protection and provisions to align standards. From an economic perspective, it's unclear what the benefits of a UK trade deal with the GCC could be. The UK already applies low tariffs fairly across the board to most imports, and the vast majority of what the UK imports from the region is oil, which is already traded without tariffs. On the other side of things, only about 4% of UK exports go to the Gulf, so there are a few economic prizes to be won from liberalisation in that direction as well. To be honest, the economic benefits of most trade deals are fairly negligible when it comes to free trade agreements. You know, the UK has just signed a new FTA with Australia, which the Department for International Trade itself estimates will add just 0.02% to the UK economy over 15 years. Given all that, we might ask, why bother? And in the absence of compelling economic reasons, I think we have to see this proposed deal with the GCC as mainly about geopolitics and presentation and positioning on the part of the UK government. It's part of a post-Brexit rush in the last year and a half on the part of the UK to sign deals, and those are undoubtedly a great way of grabbing headlines. But the cynical view would be that these operate as kind of a rolling cycle of PR coups that allow ministers to justify Brexit to the electorate while delivering little economically. Now, stepping away from the kind of more political commentary, I want to touch on the role of human rights in all this. Trade policy is, I think, about more than simply trade. There's not some kind of unique agenda that operates removed from everything else. It's not in a separate world from our broader labour rights or human rights obligations. And it's increasingly accepted that human rights, for instance, have a role within trade policy. There's a history stretching back to the 90s and beyond of policymakers using trade deals to try and advance human rights aims. And I think human rights are relevant to trade agreements for two main reasons. Firstly, liberalizing trade agreements open up opportunities for what we might call social dumping. So the idea that international companies can source from countries where wages are lower, labor conditions are poorer, and there are fewer social protections from workforces. And this means that the liberalized economic trading system has in some ways created a kind of significant downward pressure on rights. You've got countries and companies competing to provide goods to the market as cheaply as possible. And the existence of things like sweatshop labor and garment supply chains owe a great deal to these liberalizing trade agreements that on one hand have created opportunities for trade and investment, but on the other hand have failed to add obligations or duties on countries or companies to safeguard human rights. The second link between rights and free trade agreements is that, as we've seen, modern trade agreements are about more than just trade. They're about diplomacy and geopolitics and domestic politics too. So based on that, why should they seek to include just economic outcomes? I think it would be appropriate for trade deals to include commitments on action on diplomatic priorities of the UK and shared values such as the realization of human rights or even something like climate change. And UK ministers have made positive noises about bringing human rights into trade negotiations. The Trade Secretary said late last year, the government is clear that more trade will not come at the expense of human rights. But as yet, we've had very little in the way of detail of what that would look like or firm commitments in terms of how that will be incorporated into the different free trade agreements that are being negotiated. There's no sign that this proposed deal with the Gulf Cooperation Council will change this. The government has brought out its stated objections to the deal, but that includes very little on all of these important areas from gender to labour rights to human rights. And that's, again, despite the human rights issues in evidence across the region that I'm sure my fellow panelists will mention. Where the UK has mentioned human rights in trade agreements, as it has in recent FTAs with New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, these tend to be nothing but really words on a page. They're not accompanied by any significant kind of enforcement, and there is no means through which, if a country reneges from what it's agreed in a trade agreement, there will be any kind of sanction or enforcement that will follow from that. So in that sense, we can see these commitments as little more than window dressing. So just to finish, some things that we'd like to see in the UK's post-Brexit trade deals, including that with the Gulf, if they're going to deliver on human rights. Firstly, we think deals should only be struck on the condition that both parties to the deal, the UK and, for instance, the Gulf states, commit to a shared set of key values, which would, as Ruth said in her introduction, possibly include the core UN human rights conventions and the core ILO labour rights conventions. And this already exists, as Ruth said, in the GSP Plus scheme, through which market access is offered to some developing countries by the UK. Our second test is that deals should be subject to a thorough human rights impact assessment. This is approaching the norm, particularly for EU trade policy, but as yet the UK has not committed to anything in this regard. Our third test is that new trade agreements should contain some kind of mechanism for holding corporations accountable if they fail to support human rights and labour rights in their supply chains. And there are various examples that I won't get into now because of time of new trade agreements doing interesting and innovative things in this regard. And there's a lot that UK can learn from internationally. Our fourth test is that no new trade agreement should include the investor-state dispute settlement clause, which is, as many will know, a controversial mechanism that allows corporations to sue states if government policies have damaged corporate profits, and that's been used even when those government policies have been put in place specifically to protect human rights or to protect the environment. So these are the 4 features that we want to see in any trade deal. If UK trade policy with the Gulf or with any of the other free trade partners that we're seeking to negotiate agreements with is going to realistically support and uphold human rights and labour rights. I'll look forward to taking any questions once we've heard from the rest of the panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. I think that gives us a really good introduction to the issues with free trade agreements and how it overlaps with some of the human rights concerns. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who is Vani Saraswathi, who's going to help us understand a bit about how the sort of what the environment's like for migrant workers currently in the Gulf. Vani is the editor-at-large and director of projects at migrantrights.org, a Gulf-based advocacy organisation that aims to advance the rights of migrant workers. She has lived in Qatar and has mobilised grassroots communities to document migrant narratives, ignite local discussion and encourage change. She's a member of several migrant rights organisations, advisory groups, and acts as an expert commentator in international forums, including the UN. She's author of Stories of Origin, The Invisible Lives of Migrants in the Gulf, which I encourage you to all go and have a look at. Vani, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot, Tom. Your introduction actually helped me frame my arguments as well. I just want to build on what Tom said before I give an overall perspective of what the situation is like in the Gulf in terms of human rights of labor migrants and women in specific. I won't go into great detail about women migrants. I think Shaikha is better placed to speak about it with more authority. One of the things that Tom mentioned is what is the economic benefits of having such a trade agreement, and that's something that I was looking into as well. The access preference for UK headquartered companies within the Gulf to participate in the infrastructure. There's always been a push for it. We see it in different, when there are different projects that are taking place, be it the World Cup or Dubai Expo, or the huge project that's coming up in Saudi. So we need to be conscious on where UK businesses are setting foot and what kind of practices they might embrace, which they may not in their own countries. So that's something to look out for. In terms of what we can expect, the demand from the Gulf countries in order for the trade agreement to go through in terms of conventions, we are also seeing a move to be more active in non-binding initiatives like the Global Compact for Migration, like the International Migration Review Forum, where you see Gulf governments being very active because there's really no binding commitment on them, and they can present their, PR spiel without any debate. And so we need to be quite conscious of that, whether that is going to be accepted. We are seeing an increasing acceptance of that as an alternative to binding conventions. Having said that, I just want to get into the actual issues facing these countries. There is the narrative of temporariness of migrant workers in the region, even though the labor market in some countries is as high as 93% of the labor market is migrant workers, and over 80% in a few of the countries of the population are migrants. Yet the narrative of temporariness continues, even though the fertility rates are dropping, and it's going to continue. What this means is every policy designed, every law that is rolled out speaks to the temporariness. It makes sure that there is no real inclusion or belonging, because that would lead to more agency, exercising more agency and more political power within these countries. And that is being denied. So it's not just in terms of what is the labor code if it's exploitative, it's just what is this environment that creates for decades, generations of temporariness, and nobody questions that. And that's something that we really need to look into. And the reason that that persists is, even though most of these countries are welfare states for its citizens, adequate investments haven't been made in social welfare services. So elderly care, childcare, all these things don't exist. Instead, they make it very easy and very cheap for individuals to recruit and employ domestic workers, mainly female, from impoverished countries, and where they're not governed by anything other than the kafala system. Where the domestic workers law do exist, they're just glorified contracts. So you have this thing of outsourcing state responsibility to the individual without accountability, and it impacts migrants to a great degree. That is not to say that it's only lower income migrants who suffer from these issues, be it lack of gender provisions for gender-based violence, or mobility for women, or the freedom of association for all residents, including citizens. None of this exists. It just becomes more amplified and more marginalizing when you're a lower income migrant worker from Asia or Africa. You may have the power of your embassies if you come from the global north, which doesn't exist for the vast majority of workers. So to also look at what are the things that are missing that affects everybody in the country, and then of course impacts migrant workers the worst. You're going to see more and more women joining in skilled sectors, white collar jobs, which means more and more women from countries abroad are going to be brought in to play the roles at home. So looking into that power dynamic is also really important. We need to also look at the lack of civil society or effective unions. There are a couple of countries in the Gulf that do have unions, but they do not allow full participation for migrant workers. The others have no unions at all, which means, and no civil society. The civil society space is extremely restricted, except for probably Kuwait and to an extent Bahrain, which means there are gatekeepers outside of these countries who will control the narrative of what issues migrants face. And when they're not invested, if it's not the voice of the worker, it's not them, the stakeholders themselves exercising agency, then other political issues do come into play. So that is something, again, that we need to look out for and make sure any trade agreement comes with these basic rights for the vast number of labor force in these Gulf countries. There is also a tendency to deflect these criticisms to bring in worker welfare standards or joint committees, which are fine for, within a project, but really falls short if the labor law doesn't meet the basic human rights requirements of migrant workers. So we will see this, we will see as bigger projects come in, welfare standards being replaced, being put up as a solution instead of actually having better laws. In terms of, and this is something maybe looking at how the UK Modern Day Slavery Act could be leveraged within the trade agreement when, and looking at how the businesses that are participating are in compliance with that. Another issue that we see, which is lack of transparency, which has an impact across all kinds of the lived experiences of everyone, be it sociocultural inclusion or economic inclusion or labor rights. And it manifests itself in different ways. If you look at it for businesses in particular, what you see is why wage theft is one of the rampant issues facing labor migrants. And if you follow the money, you realize that the biggest projects, the biggest infrastructure projects, investment it goes back to the government, it goes back to the public sector. And when you engage with businesses, multinational businesses as well, what you hear back is governments don't pay on time, and there is a pay when pay practice. So when governments don't pay on time, and there is a very deep and entrenched subcontracting chain, that means the company at the very bottom of this chain does not have the wherewithal for a long credit cycle. Bigger companies can manage it. So when you're going, and there is no transparency in the sense that you don't know who owns these companies. You don't have a public statement for shareholders. There are a few families and a few big names that control all businesses in each of these countries. And they also invest in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, and food security, it's the same group of people who control both investments abroad and the businesses locally, and very powerful. So when they have a liquidity crunch or when they're not paying people, it has really devastating impact. We've seen this repeatedly. We saw it during the Gulf blockade. We saw it during the economic recession. Before that, we saw it during the pandemic. Just following the money, how do we put in place practices that will prevent this, that when companies come in to do businesses in the Gulf or when Gulf institutions work abroad, how do they make sure that payments are processed? These are some of the simple things that can be fixed.
Vani, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. And then finally, I just want to say that we need to keep in mind that you hear a lot about reforms from Saudi, UAE, Qatar. These reforms are responding to criticism. They have failed to address the actual problem. So the problems exist. The laws that come up respond to criticism with no real intent or mechanism for implementation. And the hierarchies within these countries have to be taken into consideration on why this is so. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Vani. Just to pick up on one thing you mentioned, you briefly mentioned the kafala system. I wonder if you could just explain for people who don't know what that is and how it works.
So anyone outside of the free zones, if you're a business or an individual, to operate, to work in the Gulf, you need a sponsor. Except if you're a domestic worker, all sponsorship has to be through a citizen. If you're a domestic worker, then your sponsor could be another expatriate, provided they meet a certain minimum salary requirement. That is the crux of the kafala, but that isn't. The kafala is actually a network of laws across various ministries that influence the sponsorship relationship. Where it doesn't exist is in these different free zones where you could have 100% ownership. And they have a different set of regulations. But I mean, very briefly, it's a sponsorship thing. And when we call for kafala reform, that's really not possible because it has to be dismantled completely. It cannot be reformed. There are so many different laws that influence how the sponsorship relationship works. I don't know if that made sense.
Thanks, that's great. We may get more questions about that, but that's really good to know. And thank you for giving us the overview of the situation for migrant workers. I think there are various organisations in the UK who've been looking at this issue because of the Qatar World Cup coming up. So again, we may have more questions around that coming up. So I will continue to our next speaker, who is Shaikha Al-Hashem, a PhD researcher at the European Graduate School and a women and migrant workers' rights activist. She's published and spoken out on issues related to women and migrant workers, specifically migrant domestic workers in Kuwait. And she's worked as a consultant for the International Labour Organization and the International Organization of Migration. She's a non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. Shaikha, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you, Vani and Tom. The way I, conceptualized this talk, I actually had a very kind of semi-structure in my mind. But when I just heard Vani talk, I might just add a few things and go in the middle and then go back to the issue related to women. Just to add to what Vani said, and since we're talking about UK and GCC, in terms of kafala, actually, anyone who's read in the history of kafala will know that it is actually a UK product that, its roots go back all the way to British colonialism and the British protectionism in Bahrain and in Kuwait, actually. So the roots of kafala back in Bahrain and then in Kuwait, the British protectionists at that time and the British missions used to be in charge of the foreign labor in the GCC countries, while the rulers were in charge of their own citizens. And this was done through the sponsorship kind of system. And so the visas were issued for the migrant or the foreign workers under the British provinces. After sort of like independence or decolonization, this system was actually incorporated as part of the structure. And because of the oil boom and the rise in migrant labor, this was the best sort of system that was incorporated to, again, manage migrant workers. And to understand this backdrop, also to understand the fact that why we have over 90% of our population migrant labor, and how this kind of impacts the issue of gender, is at the heart of the political economy. And unfortunately, the literature tends to look at Gulf countries only as oil fields, and it doesn't, take into account the various complexities in terms of class, in terms of gender, and in terms of the labor market, and how they all interact. And one of the most important thing is to understand the concept of the rentier state. And so basically, the rentier state relies on, yes, one product, but how it manages the rest of the economy is also very important, because especially if we look at the current national visions, the very ambitious national visions, which incorporate all these conventions, all the UN, sustainable development goals into these visions, and a lot of the visions also talk about a demographic imbalance, including more women into their agendas. And so understanding the rentier framework within this also, it doesn't work without the concept of neoliberalism, because a lot of people don't think it's just because we rely on oil, we're not impacted, for example, by capitalism, by neoliberalism, but actually it all ties up together. And so this one-sided view does not help us understand, for example, how incorporating, for example, women, impacts a lot of these trade agreements. So in terms of like the trade agreements, because trade agreements don't really include chapters or clauses related to women empowerment or women inclusion until very recently, because of the Buenos Aires joint declaration. And only one country of the GCC actually joined, which is the UAE. The others have not yet. But even if they do, and this is something that it worries me, because yes, we've signed up for the Sustainable Development Goals, we've incorporated them into the national visions, but are they just tokenization for women, and are they for a specific class of women? And so again, when we talk about gender, when we talk about labor market, we need to also incorporate the class formations, and the class formations are extremely very complex. And so I'm going to focus specifically today on the gender aspect. Migrant workers will definitely come up. So when we talk about adding a gender chapter, for example, when I looked at the information consultation note, I noticed there was no mention of gender, bit about labor, and then I went and I searched for the questionnaire, and there was only like question 6 and question 8, which listed women empowerment as a sort of area for opportunities, but it didn't specifically mention that. And the fact that I'm guessing the information consultation came out after the questionnaire means that, again, gender was not included, or the idea of women being part of this trade agreement was not really important. So it's also very important to clarify misconceptions related to Gulf women, especially their portrayal in Western media and discourse. We need to have an understanding of the nature and the dynamics of the political economy, and as I said earlier, and when we look at the problem with Western discourse and the media, it orientalizes the imagery of women in the GCC and positions them in the sort of binary of either cosmopolitan, educated, English-speaking entrepreneur, or veiled, mute, dark figure who is oppressed by Islam or society. And so the former sort of needs to be empowered, while the other needs to be saved. And this is where we see sort of the capitalist discourse come in, the private enterprise comes in as the savior, and it segments And by segmenting women, it reinscribes gender norms and may inadvertently as well introduce new forms of subjugation. But this discourse says nothing of the deep inequalities, the feminization of labor and poverty, how, for example, empowering women in the GCC to occupy certain positions or to enter to the job market will, as Vani mentioned earlier, rely on, for example, the import of migrant domestic workers because since there's a lot of unpaid domestic work, the dynamics of the Gulf market is that women are not fully engaged in domestic work, so they actually rely on migrant domestic workers. And again, we see, for example, in Kuwait, about 1/5 of the labor market is actually migrant domestic workers, and they are women. So about 700,000 domestic workers in Kuwait alone for a very small population. And so Gulf women and women everywhere, as we know, are not a homogeneous group. And the way economic reforms and restructuring impacts is impacted differently to each group. And the benefits, of course, are disproportionate. And the reason this happens is that the discourse on the, again, the GCC political economy and on gender specifically fails to take into account the class formations. And so,
Shaikha, you have 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try to run through it. Just to give the audience also a brief on the labor market. So between the 1980s till today, the Gulf women participation in the labor force has actually doubled in Saudi, Qatar, in Kuwait and Bahrain, and has nearly tripled in the UAE and Oman. And the gender gap in labor participation remains the widest in Saudi and the narrowest in Kuwait and Qatar. And the reason for this increased level is because of the, more women are going to higher education, and there are changes in also fertility and marriage. And of course, the, globalization has a role. And while most of the countries in the GCC have reformed their labor law, discrimination is more cultural than it is than it is legislative. So I'm going to try to stop here. I wanted to touch upon female entrepreneurship, but we can talk about it in the discussion.
Great, thank you. And I think, we've had lots of discussions here in the UK about gender chapters and how useful they are, and how seriously those provisions and the agreement at the WTO has been taken. So I'd be really interested to continue that discussion in the Q&A. Just to remind people, please do start putting your questions in the Q&A. We will be coming to that shortly. I will move on to our next speaker, who's James Lynch, the founding director of Fair Square, where he provides expert analysis on a range of human rights issues, and a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has served as Amnesty International's Middle East Deputy Director and as Deputy Director at the anti-corruption organisation Transparency International. Previously, he worked for UK Foreign Office and headed the FCO Gulf team. His current work focuses on labour, civil and political rights, with a particular focus on migrant workers. James, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ruth, and thanks, Tom, Shaikha and Vani as well. Really pleased to be here. I mean, I was going to speak a little because of my background, both in sort of foreign policy, UK foreign policy in the Gulf, and also human rights in the region. I was going to speak a little bit about how trade relations and human rights sort of sit within sort of UK activities and policies in the Gulf, in the GCC. So the sort of starting point, I guess, is just to be, a sort of clear assertion that trade has always sat alongside security as a really key goal in the Gulf for the UK. And, since the 1970s, a lot of the kind of energy in bilateral relations has gone towards trade promotion. The most obvious and sort of famous examples are like the Al Yamama arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Energy of imports of energy have become a big feature of the trading relationship in recent years, particularly LNG from Qatar. But the trade links go a lot deeper than this. Obviously, if you look at UAE, which is the biggest export market for the UK in the whole of the Middle East and North Africa region, there is really quite deep UK relationships in tourism and hospitality, the financial services, and retail. I wanted to just bringing up to kind of the modern day. I think a good starting point here is the global financial crisis in 2008. Following that, we had a Tory-led coalition government in the UK that was concerned about the fact that the UK's trade was way too sort of focused on its close neighbours in the EU. There was the stat that did the rounds at the time was that the UK exported more to Ireland than to India, Russia, and China combined. So it reflected a kind of concern that the UK's sort of trade profile was parochial almost, and needed to be more global in nature and more ambitious. And so the Gulf was at the top of the list. And so there was a lot of effort went into aligning political relations to support trade promotion in the Gulf during the 2010s. There were specific kind of mechanisms developed, like the UK UAE task force. We have a UK-Qatar strategic dialogue that's actually quite recent in the way that's been set up. And the idea was to sort of marshal the whole of HMG activities, whether that be sort of defense, political and economic components, around a common set of goals with trade promotion as a really key goal. So, and it has seen, there's been a lot of increase in the UK's sort of exports to the Gulf have increased a lot since then. Although, a chunk of that is just going to be down to the fact that the economies of the region have grown, particularly some of them quite dramatically so in that time. So, in that context, questions around sort of values, like, and I use that term very, very loosely, but, in the UK foreign policy terms, that means human rights and democracy. Those have been pretty marginal in the GCC historically. It's not to say they've been absent. Clearly the British Embassy in Riyadh does work on freedom of expression. It does work on the death penalty. But it's very unusual for these sort of issues to play a substantial role in the political and economic relationships in the region. And that really caught Britain out in 2011, as it did many Western countries. The uprisings across the region kind of raised the question of whether these deep relationships with quite authoritarian states really served British interests, whether they delivered the kind of stability that they had sort of claimed to in the past. And so we saw a bit of rejigging at that point of some of the strategies, particularly in the GCC, to add in a kind of reform element into the sort of basket of objectives that Britain had, sort of political reform. But I think, it didn't take long. Obviously, sort of, the periods of 2012, 2013, 2014 saw, the Gulf states kind of acting to suppress dissent, to squash civil society and other kind of critics. And so I think, things returned very much to business as usual very quickly, and if they ever really stopped being business as usual. I think where Brexit comes in was to reinforce that trend, the trend where, questions of values would be subservient to the ideas of trade promotion and security partnership. And I think that obviously reflected the fact that, Britain was massively changing its relationship with its closest neighbours and sort of traditional allies economically and politically. And so it was sort of in search of new friends. And we saw Theresa May very quickly after the Brexit referendum saying she was going to turbocharge relations with the GCC. Now, at the trade deal, I think Tom made some interesting points there about what difference does a trade deal make? And I've seen a lot of skepticism about whether or not a UK GCC trade deal would actually change much. Is it really in Britain's economic interests? If you're trying to do as I saw somebody say, if you're trying to do a joint venture on education in the UAE, does a trade deal actually make any difference to your likelihood of doing that? And I think 30 to 40% of the UK's exports to the GCC are services. So the degree to which this really has a transformative impact, I think, is I guess to be seen. I think as I would support Tom's sort of suggestion that this is largely political. This is about showing the Brexit benefits, which has obviously been called into question domestically in the UK. But it's also about cementing the UK's strategic partnerships in the Gulf. I guess that then raises questions, and this is where we kind of come back to the sort of human rights side. If we see, the UK seeking to cement and further deepen these strategic relationships that, cut across these various spheres, including, very importantly, defense and security. I mean, how does that sort of deepening align with the sort of supposed shift in UK foreign policy that towards confronting authoritarianism. And I kind of think it's important to draw attention here. Obviously we have the current, crisis in Ukraine, where the notions of authoritarianism and the international defense of the international order, international institutions are kind of, that's how this is being framed, certainly from the UK side and other Western countries. And if you look at the international, the integrated review from last year, which was sort of, the articulation of the UK security priorities, it was very notable. It was quite a shift from the 2015 version, much more talk of values. There was somebody said to me, ideology is back after the kind of emerging economy, sort of very kind of classic sort of neoliberal trade promotion of the early 2010s. The sort of ideas of values and democracy, human rights, open societies, these are pretty prominent in that document. And I think, the question is, what does that mean for the Gulf? Because we know that as Vani and Shaikha have sort of pointed out, it's not like these it's not like human rights issues are absent in the Gulf. It has been very controversial at a domestic level in the UK, these deep strategic relationships. And I guess a few of the kind of key examples to highlight, obviously the killing of Jamal Khashoggi put the UK government under quite a lot of pressure to explain this deep strategic relationship it had been building with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. The UAE's treatment of Matthew Hedges, who, a British student who was in prison for several months, subjected to torture and ill treatment and accused of being a spy, subjected and convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment before he was eventually pardoned. And of
James,
course,
you have 1 minute.
1 minute. That's good. Okay, I'm just about on track. And of course, the Yemen war, in which the UK is itself, been accused of complicity by various people, including a former development minister, for the degree to which it's arming the Saudi armed forces. So where does that sit? If the UK is supposed to be, confronting authoritarianism, how do these relationships sit within that? Very uncomfortably. There isn't, I don't think, any evidence of an immediate shift. Jane Kinnamont, who's somebody who follows these issues very closely, I saw had spotted that yesterday in a discussion with Blinken, Liz Truss was saying we must end our dependence on authoritarians, and then saying that the Gulf states would be key partners to do that. So I think that raises kind of an interesting question. I think my sort of final thought is, I think the contradiction between what the UK says it believes at a global level and how it behaves in the Gulf, I think those contradictions are going to have always been fairly stark. I think they're going to become more so and not less so.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers for really great interventions. So we're going to move on to questions, and I'm going to abuse my position as chair to kick things off. So obviously in the UK, negotiations towards a trade agreement start to shine a bit of a spotlight for those of us that are interested in trade on the kind of issues within the Gulf. But we also have the Qatar World Cup this year. So it does feel like there is a bit of a moment here where what's going on in the Gulf, the situation for migrant workers, issues around gender and so forth, are likely to be in the spotlight. Do you think this is a moment where we might feel optimistic about change? Are there ways that we could be using this moment to try and move towards improvements? Vani, would you like to kick us off? You're on mute, Vani.
Can you just repeat the thing?
So it feels like there's just a moment where there's a bit of a spotlight sort of from the UK onto the Gulf Cooperation Council. Lots of people be interested in the World Cup. There are organisations here who've been campaigning around the conditions for migrant workers, which we know have been really poor, and we know there've been a large number of deaths associated with the construction industry there. But does this provide an opportunity for dialogue around improving the human rights situation?
Yeah, I think every big event gives an opportunity, right? Be it the Dubai Expo or the Qatar World Cup. But even if I think that opportunity, we're too late in the period now. We're just like 9 months short of it. If governments wanted to really do something and put pressure on these countries, that should have happened many years ago. At this point, they're just responding to it. In terms of the World Cup, it's definitely an opportunity for Qatar to, not just in terms of human rights, overall, to cement its position as a sporting venue, no doubt. And it's a good thing that that's happening. But when there's a criticism being targeted at it, and then you find the same group wearing jerseys that have Emirates logo, this is a little bit of a discord. This is why I also want to bring back this whole trade agreement with the GCC. What is the relationship between each of these GCC states? It is no longer what it was 5-6 years ago. So what kind of compromises will the UK make to make this, a kind of more or less same for all of the GCC states? I think that is a question we must keep in mind. And James also mentioned this whole thing about what they say globally and how they act globally. There is a huge difference. We've seen that repeatedly. Again, coming back to the World Cup, if any pressure had to be put, should have been done before British companies, other European companies participated in the tender, got huge projects, made huge profits. That's the point at which they should have interfered. Now, when they do it, it's just lip service.
Yeah. Thanks. Oh, yeah, James, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just to add a couple of thoughts on that. Yeah, I mean, I think the UK has generally been extremely reluctant to do anything that would look like being critical of its Gulf partners on almost any of these issues. So, I think the World Cup is actually a really interesting example. As Vani says, the UK's approach there was to provide some sort of education for some of the British businesses going in, to try and offer to support the government in what it was doing. And when the government signed a sort of deal with the ILO to carry out certain reforms, then we saw the UK, like the rest of the European countries, kind of come in behind that. So what they prefer to do is, rather than being in any way sort of critical or sort of holding to account, it would be, let's come in behind something that we can see as solving the problem. Now, and that may be a kind of legitimate approach. I mean, Bahrain, for example, the UK has very close links with the government, and has been accused again of sort of complicity in that repression. It's made a lot of the fact that it's supported, for example, certain accountability mechanisms, but in partnership with the government, and where that may be that may have a legitimacy. One could argue that's the right approach, right, to avoid being a kind of neo-colonialist, a former colonial power sort of dictating terms. It's inconsistent with the way the UK behaves elsewhere, where it is prepared to be quite critical, to speak out on individual cases, for example. Only very rarely will the UK do that in the GCC, where we're put under intense pressure, where there's some UK locus. And I guess, where this really came home to roost was the Yemen court case, where civil society took the government to court and said, you shouldn't be sending these arms to Yemen and to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. And the government fought that all the way, lost an appeal, had to stop for a year, and then just went immediately back to selling those arms. So, it's always, held back from any criticism, even over the most egregious sort of airstrikes.
Thanks, Tom. We've heard mentioned that UK companies are benefiting directly from the Qatar World Cup. Do you see any hope that they might exert some sort of influence? Have they been adapting at all in terms of their practices or contributing to any sort of improvement in that area?
Not hugely. I mean, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre has our section on our website where we track the responses of companies whose supply chains have been involved in the World Cup, whether that's construction, hotel, tourism operators, those kinds of things, and we kind of continue over the next 9 months raising these issues with those companies and trying to get them to respond. Responses, as you can imagine, have been fairly low. The other comment I wanted to make, Ruth, about the idea that the World Cup could provide a moment for UK public awareness of human rights issues, and that would have an impact on the narrative surrounding a potential trade deal. I think typically, as many on this call will know, the UK public awareness of the impact of trade deals generally is very low, but generally there's quite a high level of support for individual trade deals, particularly with Australia and New Zealand that seems kind of our brother and sister countries or whatever. In contrast, when polled, and I think this was released about 6 months ago, only 27% of the UK public supported the idea of a trade deal with Saudi Arabia. And they only use Saudi Arabia in that poll, but I think that kind of reflects a fairly low level of general support for this kind of government policy. And I think maybe that those messages will at some point start to be heard by the Department of International Trade.
Thanks. And finally, Shaikha, do you see this as a moment where there might be change in the air, or is that looking unlikely?
Well, there are cosmetic reforms. So that the problem is that we can, again, portray, for example, I'll use women as an example, as they are part of the national visions. They are going to be there. And a lot of talks are on, for example, reforms. But on the ground, we're not seeing that. For example, in Kuwait, we've had a lot of cases of femicides over the past 2 years, actually. And the government has been silent on that, despite the fact that we have civil societies who have mobilized and come together and protested. And what's happening, for example, in Kuwait is also affecting, for example, other GCC countries who are, again, sort of governing and monitoring also the actions of their own civil societies. And then you see, for example, a rise in female employment in Saudi Arabia as a sort of reaction to what's happening in Kuwait. But again, how effective is this? We don't know down the line. And all of these things, for example, the hiring of female employees or entrepreneurs in Saudi or in Qatar, for example, are all part of state feminist agendas. And they're not really specifically, again, catering to other different classes. As well, for example, when it comes to what Vani mentioned earlier in terms of unions and the right to organize by, for migrant workers, this is not possible, again, because of the structure itself. And the reason, and a lot of people need to ask, is why we have most of our migrant workers coming from southeast, southern, the global south. If we look at the history, for example, the earlier migrants were from Arab countries, but because the authoritarian regimes feared that the Arab nationals will have influence on the GCC citizens, and this will ultimately kind of change the politics. They prefer to they opted for the migrants from the global south who don't share their religion, who don't share, for example, or even if they do share their religion, they don't share the language. They're concerned with only be for on remittances. And for that reason, they will not be interested into, for example, organizing. They would simply be temporary. And that's something that, again, is not part of the changes in reforms. For example, even the reforms on kafala that Vani mentioned, it does not extend to domestic work, for example. It was deliberately excluded when, for example, Saudi released their statement.
Great, thanks. I'm going to move on to another question because we have one more question in the chat and actually not very much time. So there's a question from Kira from Friends of the Earth, who's asking, do any of the speakers have any insight into labour or human rights or environmental impacts of GCC states looking to improve renewable credentials by developing solar or extracting other resources? Our now Foreign Secretary, when she was our Trade Secretary, was very keen to promote the GCC as key partners for achieving climate goals, which to most of us seems slightly odd. So do you have any thoughts about that, about the kind of shift towards the renewables sector and what the impacts might be for human rights on that? Anybody keen to jump in at that point? Otherwise, I will nominate someone. James.
Not so much in renewable energy, but
Vani, go ahead.
Oh, so James, carry on. Yeah.
No,
You
I
just
was I was just going to. The only thing I was going to say is I think people are working on that. I was just going to highlight on energy and in the context of the UK relationship with the Gulf. I do think that people expecting the UK to play a more decisive role on human rights in Qatar, or frankly, most of the the US as well, I think will be disappointed because of the increased importance of Qatari gas, which is we have this global energy crisis right now, and I think that's probably just a wider point I wanted to make. But Vani, you may have been answering that more directly.
No, and not specifically on renewable energy, but the impact of climate change on migrant workers. There's a really good study that's come out across the region. Climate change impacts migrant workers, but there is a good study in Kuwait that looks at I think 2 or 3 times higher mortality rates among migrants due to heat stress and FESC, of course, has done quite a bit of work around heat stress. So, and how, again, policies don't address the impact of climate change on migrant workers, specifically on the most vulnerable. I wanted to make a point on the previous thing, but I'll wait for your next question.
Thanks. Tom, did you want to come in on the question of renewable energies?
No, I'm happy with the answers that have been given by my fellow panelists.
Great. Okay, Vani, did you want to pick on your previous point?
Yeah, I just want to, and there's a question that kind of touches upon it as well. A free trade agreement with Gulf countries is not probably the same as with some of the other regions, because this agreement is going to be with a group of very powerful families and businesses. There's not going to be any kind of public accountability locally either. And there is a question that touches on it, on how this handful of people in each of these countries not only control, say, the Shura Council, they control all of the businesses, all of the investments abroad. So maybe what would apply to other free trade agreements won't apply to what is being proposed within the Gulf.
Thanks. So we have very little time. So I'm going to ask one final question. I'm going to ask our speakers to answer in a couple of sentences, which is, given that lots of organizations here in the UK and individuals are going to be concerned about these negotiations as they roll along, and given some of the constraints that we have here in terms of input to those negotiations, what do you think we should be aiming to do now, given we have this window where the negotiations will be about to launch and going ahead? Shaikha.
We need to do actual research with again, that moves just beyond the usual people that we sit with on the table. For example, when I was looking at the consultation, the information note, again, it's reflecting elite business people, as certain class. Again, these are big dynasties, and they mobilize all the capital, and it's a huge network. If we really want, and today is a testimony to this, is for us to discuss what the remainder of the population thinks about such a free trade agreement, how it's going to impact, whether it's in the UK or in the GCC countries. So I think it's really important to have the conversation decentralized, and to sit with civil societies and to ensure what is reflected, again, is not just, it's something that looks nice on paper and that we can just have press releases and take pictures. It really moves beyond that. How far can we enforce this? Because this is really, really important, is how far, just like the joint declaration, including women and women empowerment, how far is it going to really impact? When I say women empowerment, how will it impact migrant domestic workers, for example? So it's these little things that we need to take into consideration.
That's great, thanks for that. Although Tom was saying at the start of this session that the economic benefits of trade agreements are limited, very often, if they are comprehensive, and we can anticipate that this will be, that's the UK's aim, they do impact on regulation in both parties' economies. They'll impact on service provision, they'll impact on digital economy, which is going to be increasingly important. And so those are all of the things that we're concerned about. And indeed, we'd really like much more consultation with sort of citizens in the UK than happens at present. Tom, what should we be doing in the next year or two on this issue?
I think the UK government needs to ask itself what its trade policy is designed to achieve. And if the supposed focus on supporting human rights, creating business opportunities, solving climate change, supporting development, all of these high-flown and extremely important aims are truly front of mind, then the question is whether free trade agreements are an appropriate vehicle for furthering those aims. And I suspect that if we start thinking along those lines, the answer would be no.
Yeah, thanks. And we know that at the moment there is no strategy from the UK that illustrates how its trade agreement might align with the rest of its foreign policy objectives, which we consider to be a bit of a hole in the plan. James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that strategy would be good. That kind of building it into the wider strategy, that particularly on this issue of sort of open societies and authoritarianism. I do think sort of specifically, I think people can be a bit skeptical about including a human rights clause in these kinds of agreements. But I think the EU example is kind of interesting, right? They have a human rights element to all of their trade agreements, I think, since 2009. Never been activated, right, to end a free trade agreement. But that's kind of not, I think there is still a benefit there to having it there, because it provides an ability to have that discussion and a kind of locus for that conversation. And I think that sometimes, there's certainly some question mark about, does the UK have the kind of bargaining power that the EU has? It's a smaller market. But I think the GCC really wants this deal. It wants this deal because GCC countries are trying to diversify their economies, try to get investment in various different sectors and things. So I do think that the UK has the ability to ask for that, and I think that it could be that human rights clause certainly shouldn't be one way. It should be both ways. It should be the ability to have the conversation about human rights in both contexts. I think if this is going to happen, it would be good to have it as part of that broader strategy, so it's aligned in some way. So there's some kind of rationale from the British perspective. But if it's going to happen, I do think that should be the push.
Thanks. And we've just seen with New Zealand that the UK has finally made environment provisions enforceable, where they come under the same dispute settlement mechanism as the rest of the trade deal, which is highly unusual, and there's been a big critique from us. We then have points about how you enforce language like we will collaborate, talk to each other, cooperate and share information, and what the point of enforcing that is. However, it's definitely a step forward, and I think it'd be good to see that kind of move when it comes to the human rights clauses. And final words to Vani, what would your recommendation be?
We've seen that UK, I don't want to get into details on that, but arbitration between companies to settle financial disputes happens quite often in the UK. We've seen it with Omani companies as well. So maybe looking at how that could be extended with a rights lens, where the workers, the debts within the company are not prioritized, right? So looking at that in terms of the arbitration that's provided.
Great, and don't get me started on arbitration. I think it's one of the Gulf states whose sovereign wealth funds sued Sudan because its assets were not sufficiently protected during a civil war. It's one of my favorite ISDS cases, just for illustrating how terrible the system is. So on that note, I want to thank all of our speakers for some really interesting discussion today. We have been recording this, and we will be posting it online as soon as we have that all up and running. Please do look out for that. There have been some interesting links shared in the chat, so we'll stay here for a couple more minutes in case you want to take a look at those. And don't forget, we have a further 5 sessions coming. The next 3 are all about climate change, so please do join us for those. Thank you very much.
Thanks.